Okay, so we were talking about the two Elizabeth Smart ideographs. So we had the one that existed up until last month, but now we've got this brand new Elizabeth Smart ideograph, this record where she gave a public speech, and now we've got this in the digital archive. So what are we going to do with it? Well, let's talk about how this ideograph can be used as a compelling narrative for policy change. So we talked about interpretive monopolies in video 1. In this case here, let's talk about the interpretive monopoly being sex education makes girls promiscuous. So if sex education is bad, then let's only talk about abstinence-only education. This is the position taken in Utah, where Elizabeth Smart was born and raised. On the other side, we have two narrative communities, actually. So we have the conservative narrative community over here, and over here we have a more progressive narrative community. The narrative which they would rather have on this side of the policy campaign is girls are empowered by knowledge, a sense of self-worth and choice. And that's the new, that's what we on the progressive side would like people to believe. So we have these competing narrative communities. One is very, very closed, and it's the research calls it a closed narrative community or a closed policy network, because they have their worldview, and if you subscribe to it, then you're allowed to be in the in-group, and that's the sustaining institution that enforces all of this. So this sustaining institution keeps this narrative alive, and it keeps it pure by creating this out-group for anybody who doesn't belong. On the other side, we have a sustaining institution for the progressive narrative. This is a community typically characterized by dialogue, and it has a very diverse membership. So these narrative communities really don't get along. So this was the Elizabeth Smart family in 2003, and this was my family in 2003. My third child, my oldest daughter, was raised very, very differently from Elizabeth Smart. And so anybody who's in this narrative community is made to feel welcome by this other community over here. So the non-believers that are thrown out are allowed to come over here. But what happens on the flip side of it, especially for me, is I pose, and anybody in this narrative community pose, a worldview threat against this narrative community over here, because their interpretive monopoly has to be hard and fast, and it has to be preserved and protected at all costs. And so this worldview threat is what allows, what prevents these two narrative communities from talking to each other. So in comes Elizabeth Smart. So we have these two narrative communities, and we need to engineer a new emergent narrative community. So this is what my research is all about, is creating what I call this emergent narrative community, a new community that's going to move forward and leave these communities behind, especially this one here. We can't deconstruct interpretive monopolies because that's perceived as a worldview threat. So you have to actually create a new narrative that will have enough power and enough momentum behind it so that it will displace this one and just kind of make it smaller and take it down in size and make it manageable and smaller, and fewer people will actually subscribe to those interpretive monopolies. So this new narrative, emergent narrative community is what my research is all about. So in my research I've talked about three audiences. So audience number one is where we build this shared premise. Audience number two is we build this broad support in the heterogeneous policy network so that we can actually get the policy ideas onto the agenda. And audience number three is that you have to deal with the worldview threat capitalists. And I call them that because what they do is they go around making people afraid, and they make money off of it. So the media, and the conservative media in the United States, they actually make a lot of money by making people afraid, by giving them radio programming that makes them afraid. And so then they donate money to the Republicans, well, on the extreme end of the Republicans, the Tea Party candidates. And this is how they build their war chest, and how they get money out of the people who are easily made afraid. So we have to create a third audience that deals with how to mitigate the impact of these very, very wealthy global elite people who are just in it for the money. So these narrative communities come together now. We want to build a new emergent community, and Elizabeth Smart enters the picture, the new Elizabeth Smart ideograph. And that's really what this case study was all about, is how to use any little record in very, very powerful ways in order to get this compelling narrative. So once again, just to recap, we talk about media in two different ways, as records in the institutional memory, and as how those records are used in a heterogeneous policy network to actually make the material very, digital media can be both usable by drilling out and creating these individual media communities and fostering those, and by also drilling out and creating these individual narrative communities out here and creating a sustaining institution that will utilize them and make these compelling narratives, which makes this digital media useful as well. Thank you for watching the videos. I encourage you to look at the other videos on my webpage as well at www.moxie.com. That's MOCSIE.com. Thanks.